My parents were very long-time members of this church. As a boy, I remember sitting in this front pew with my family every single Sunday growing up. I went to Sunday school here, I was confirmed here, I was married here, as was my sister Maureen. And now, both of my parents have had their funeral services here. I could say something about the circle of life, but I feel that puts too much emphasis on an ending. And I know neither of my parents would have wanted that. And knowing my dad, he would have said to me, "Turn the page, David." And that page isn't blank. It just says in large gold letters, Chapter 2. I want to thank each and every one of you for being here today at the celebration of the life of my dad, James Obando. In these last few weeks, the outpouring of comfort and help and love for my brothers and sister and I, that my brothers and sister and I have received from so many people has meant more to us than we can possibly express in words. And it truly makes an impossible time easier to bear. It's said that parents in many ways will always see their sons and daughters as little children, no matter their age or their success later in life. By the same token, a child will always harbor the hidden expectation, no matter how irrational, that parents will always be there for us. And when the hard truth finally arrives and they're gone, nothing feels like it will ever fill the void that they leave behind. And we're left only with that cold reality that grief is truly love with nowhere now to go. Who was my dad? Why was he a good man? The day isn't long enough if I began answering that question now. And as I was writing this late one night, I thought of every virtuous attribute that you could ascribe to a person. And in each case, I had no trouble recalling endless examples of why my dad was each of those things. But there are four that I feel shined most brightly in him: humbleness, devotion, generosity, and patience. Always quicker to boast about others than himself, loyal to his family and friends, never giving up no matter how many failures, and a calm that was seemingly endless. I can count on one hand the number of times I actually heard my dad shout in exasperation. And 3 of those times actually were because of me. The rest of the time, his angry voice, his angry loud voice, was about the same as my normal conversational volume. I believe he didn't shout because Dad was a man who listened. You could always tell that he reserved judgment only after weighing all the evidence. It was a big part of his personality to never jump to conclusions or act simply out of emotion. As kids, I remember when we got in trouble, which was quite a bit, he never condemned us outright. He always began with, in a very quiet voice, "Tell me exactly what happened." As if it was most important to him not to make a mistake with his anger. When I speak of my dad, it's impossible not to include my mom. For so long, their lives were intertwined in this fascinating, complex, loving cooperation. My mom was incredibly accomplished and talented. But in many ways, my dad's talents and accomplishments rivaled hers. Graduating with a degree in electrical engineering, president of the College Amateur Radio Society, 4 years of honorable service in the U.S. Coast Guard, a distinguished 30-year career as a civil engineer with Kaiser, and after retiring, his volunteer work with Habitat for Humanity, the Boy Scouts of America, the Piedmont Police Department, and so much more. But it was through his humble nature that he accepted that Mom was best to lead the family, and he, being the tireless supporter and strength in the background. If my dad did lead in any way, it was by virtue of the fact that he believed that being a leader was not simply being in charge, but taking care of the people in your charge. As a consequence of all of this, he was never boastful. And actually, the one time I remember him saying loudly, "I am never wrong," my momentary confusion was cured when I heard my mom shouting back from the kitchen, "He's never wrong because I will always correct him." And after that, he looked at me and he smiled, that huge signature smile of his that was always on his face. He knew that's exactly what she was going to say. My dad's style of leading was more about this kind of cooperation. He wasn't one to tell you to go out and do some task. Rather, he would often already be doing that thing and instead invite you to help him. I knew even from a very early age that there was something very special about someone who did things that way. And the work he would invite us to join in on typically involved working outside in the yard. That was another part of my dad that was so fascinating to me. With all of his technical math and science knowledge, he still loved working with his hands, building things, cultivating the soil to make things grow. His huge collection of orchids were his pride and joy, and proof yet again of his devotion and patience as well as his nurturing side. My dad was born in 1930, which meant he was a young boy during a time of war. Many years ago, he told me a story, and I've come to see that story as a perfect illustration of everything I admire about him. Shortly after hostilities began in the Pacific and the enemy invaded the Philippines, my dad's father was taken as a prisoner of war. And like so many other able-bodied men at the time, he was taken to a forced labor camp. This one 90 miles north of their hometown. Although my dad was only 11, because he was the eldest, he stayed put and played a large part in providing for the family. Though he wondered constantly about how his father was or whether or not his father was even still alive. Over 4 years later, and much suffering and sacrifice for so many, the war was coming to its conclusion. The enemy was withdrawing from all fronts and abandoned one garrison and occupied town after the next. It was at this point that my dad decided he could no longer wait, and with little preparation, he simply began walking north, knowing only the general direction of the province where the camp and his father were located. The roads were hard, when there were roads, and after almost 2 weeks of traveling on foot and staying at the houses of the kind strangers who took him in each night, he found the camp. At this point, there were hundreds of men on the other side of the barbed wire fences, and all of them were thin and had heavy beards. But despite the continuing impossible odds, my dad finally saw his father. He shouted, but the shouts were drowned out by the sound of a train that was stopped close by the camp entrance. As he watched, many of the men were loaded up onto this train, some sitting atop the cars. When I asked my dad what happened next, he just exclaimed, "They left." And after talking to the local people, he found out they were actually being taken to a location close to where he had started walking. Now, I don't know exactly what my dad said in that moment, but if it were me standing there after 2 weeks of walking, those words couldn't be spoken here in the church. Still riveted by the story, I was hoping for him to have this epic reaction to such a huge disappointment. But instead, he just shrugged and said, "Then I walked home." And I remember him telling me that when he arrived, his father had already been there for almost a week. And when I asked if he was upset about all of that, his reply was, I only had the one thing to be upset about, and 1,000 reasons not to be. So why should I be upset? Everything I admire about my dad is in that story. And as I was remembering it, I found myself getting more and more sad, knowing I could never hear any more of them. Sad that I couldn't be inspired when he said things like, "The hardships are just the things you see when you stop looking at the goal." Very shortly after I saw my dad take his last breath, I felt an impossible sorrow. But I was also gripped by this sudden fear that over time I might eventually forget him and who he was. But then I looked up at my siblings, and that anxiety instantly disappeared. There's truly a void and a great emptiness in his passing, but because of who he and my mom were, the space is bridged by the connections of the family I still have surrounding me. In my brother Michael, I see my dad's sense of duty and his need to act to protect all of us. In Maureen, I see his leadership and his ability to bring order out of chaos. In my brother Robert, I see his charisma, his easygoing nature and charm, and his ability to see things as they truly are. For me, I thought for a long time that I had gotten the raw end of the deal, being socially awkward and with an uncanny ability to say the most inappropriate things at the worst times. But over time, I recognized something in my dad that felt familiar to me. And because it had a kind of pervasive subtlety, I think it wasn't obvious to others. And that thing is empathy. Being able to identify with and sense the feelings of others, especially during difficult times and times of sadness. I cherish this the most because I often ask myself the same question I think he did. What is the most important thing to me? Is it wealth, contentment, love? My dad had all three of these things and more. And yet, I think those were just wonderful byproducts of what was really the most important thing to him. To be able to touch the lives of as many people as possible in a positive way, and to always reach out to help. To just always walk in the right direction. Because of what he gave me, I know this now too. I want to thank everyone for giving me the honor of allowing me to tell you just a little bit about my dad.